For 3 months, Thomas Garrett had let his ranch fall to ruin, choosing to mourn at the small grave of his son. He thought he was alone in his emptiness until a girl no older than the child he'd buried appeared at his fence line. She was a ghost made of rags, her belly concave with starvation. She looked from the grave to the grieving man and asked a question that confused a father's grief with a child's hunger. "Mister, do you also cry from hunger?" She couldn't have been more than 8 years old with matted brown hair that hung in tangles around a face too thin for childhood. Her dress was more holes than fabric, and her bare feet were cracked and bleeding from walking on rough ground. But it was her eyes that stopped Thomas cold. They held the same emptiness he saw in his own reflection every morning, the look of someone who had lost everything and was still breathing anyway. "Mister," she said again when he didn't answer her first question, "do you also cry from hunger?" Thomas felt his throat close up. 3 months since Michael died of the fever. 3 months of eating nothing but grief and whiskey. 3 months of letting his ranch fall apart around him while he counted the ways he'd failed as a father. The girl swayed on her feet, and Thomas realized she wasn't asking about emotional hunger. She was starving. Actually starving. Her stomach was concave beneath the torn fabric, and her wrists were no thicker than kindling. "When did you last eat?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Yesterday," she said with the matter-of-fact tone children use for impossible things. "Found some berries by the creek, but they were mostly bad." Thomas looked at her more carefully. No shoes, no coat, despite the October chill. No sign of family or belongings or anyone who gave a damn whether she lived or died. Just like Michael in those final days when the fever burned so hot, and Thomas could do nothing but watch his boy slip away inch by inch. "What's your name?" Thomas asked, stepping closer. The girl flinched backward, and he stopped moving. Trust was clearly not something she gave easily. "Rose," she whispered. "Rose Murphy. My pa went to find work in the mines 2 months ago. Said he'd be back before the cold came, but winter's already starting in heat." She trailed off, but Thomas understood. Another father who'd left. Another child abandoned to survive on scraps and hope. The rage that built in his chest surprised him. He thought grief had burned out all his other emotions, but apparently anger could still find fuel in the injustice of hungry children and broken promises. "Rose Murphy," he said gently. "I'm Thomas Garrett. This is my ranch. You hungry right now?" Rose nodded quickly, then seemed to catch herself. "But I don't want charity, mister. I can work. I'm strong, even though I don't look it. I can sweep and fetch water and tend animals if you got any. I just need a little food to keep going until my pa comes back." The hope in her voice was devastating. She actually believed her father would return. Actually thought someone would keep their word to her. Thomas remembered Michael saying similar things in his last weeks. "Tomorrow I'll feel better. Tomorrow we can go fishing like you promised." Tomorrow that never came. "I don't need any work done." Thomas lied. The ranch was falling apart. Fences, broken animals, sold off buildings in desperate need of repair. But he wasn't about to make this child earn her right to eat. "But I made too much stew yesterday, and it'll go bad if nobody helps me finish it." It was another lie. He hadn't cooked a real meal since the funeral, but some lies were kindness in disguise. Rose's eyes widened. "Really, you'd share with me?" The wonder in her voice broke his heart. When had anyone last shown her simple human decency? When had she last been offered food without having to beg or work or degrade herself for it? "Come on," Thomas said, turning toward the house. "Let's get you fed." Rose followed at a careful distance, like a wild animal accepting food, but ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Thomas understood. The world had taught her that kindness usually came with a price, that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. He led her to the kitchen where dust covered everything, and open cupboards that held mostly empty cans and stale bread. But there was enough beans and salt pork and potatoes from his neglected garden. Enough to make a meal that would fill up a starving child. As Thomas cooked, he snuck glances at Rose, who stood pressed against the wall watching his every movement. She reminded him painfully of a wounded deer he'd found as a boy, beautiful and fragile and ready to flee at any sudden motion. "You can sit," he told her, gesturing to a chair at the kitchen table. Rose shook her head. "I'm fine standing, mister. Don't want to dirty your furniture." The politeness of desperation. She learned to make herself invisible to avoid giving people reasons to reject her. Thomas's hands shook as he stirred the beans. Michael had never known hunger like this, never had to apologize for existing or worry about being thrown out for taking up space. When the food was ready, Thomas filled 2 bowls and set them on the table. Rose stared at her portion like it might disappear if she blinked. "Go ahead," Thomas encouraged. "It's yours." Rose picked up the spoon with reverent care and took a small bite, then another. Then she was eating like someone drowning takes air, desperate and grateful, and terrified it wouldn't last. Thomas pretended to eat his own food, but mostly watched her. When was the last time feeding someone had given him this much satisfaction? When was the last time he'd felt useful for something other than digging graves and counting failures? "This is the best thing I ever tasted," Rose said between bites. "Thank you, Mr. Garrett. Thank you so much." Thomas nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in his throat. Michael used to thank him for simple things too, for bedtime stories and piggyback rides and teaching him to whistle. All the small kindnesses that felt like breathing when you gave them to someone you loved. "Where have you been sleeping?" Rose Thomas asked when she'd cleaned her bowl. The question made her tense up again. Different places. The old barn by Miller's Creek when it's not too cold. Under bridges when the rain comes. "I move around so nobody gets mad about me staying too long." The image of this child sleeping rough while he wallowed in his empty house made Thomas feel sick with shame. He had 4 bedrooms and a warm fireplace and more space than any one person needed. Meanwhile, Rose was huddled under bridges like some feral thing abandoned by civilization. "Storm's coming tonight," Thomas said, looking out the window at the darkening sky. "Big one. By the look of those clouds, you can't be sleeping outside in weather like that." Rose followed his gaze and her face went pale. She'd obviously been dreading the approaching winter, dreading the cold that would make survival even harder than it already was. "I'll manage," she said with false bravery. "I always do." But Thomas could see the fear underneath her words, could see how desperately she wanted someone to offer her shelter without her having to ask. Asking was dangerous. Asking revealed need, and need made you vulnerable. "There's a spare room upstairs," Thomas said carefully. "Just sitting empty. Seems wasteful to heat a whole house for one person when there's 2 of us here." Rose's eyes filled with tears. She tried to hide. "You'd let me stay. Really, I promise I won't be any trouble. I'll be quiet as a mouse and I'll leave first thing in the morning." "No rush to leave," Thomas said, surprising himself with the words. 3 months ago, he'd wanted nothing but solitude. Wanted to grieve alone and drink alone, and maybe waste away alone until he could join Michael wherever 7-year-old boys went when fever took them. But looking at Rose's grateful tears, he realized solitude wasn't healing him. It was just letting him rot from the inside out. "We'll see how the weather looks tomorrow. Make decisions then." Rose nodded eagerly and Thomas felt something shift in his chest. A loosening of the knot that had been choking him since Michael died. Purpose maybe, or just the simple relief of being needed again. That night Thomas sat in his chair by the fireplace, listening to the storm rage outside and the soft sounds of Rose settling into the room upstairs. Michael's room, he realized with a start. He put her in Michael's room without thinking about it. The room he hadn't been able to enter since the funeral, but somehow it felt right. The room had been empty too long, had been waiting for someone who needed its warmth and safety. Rose called down once to thank him again for the food and shelter. Her voice drifted through the house like a blessing he didn't deserve, but was grateful to receive. Outside, the wind howled and rain lashed the windows, but inside there was peace. The kind of peace that came from knowing someone else was safe because of choices you'd made. Thomas poured himself his usual glass of whiskey, but found he didn't want it. Didn't need the burn to mask his pain tonight. Instead, he sat sober and listened to the house come alive again with the presence of someone who mattered. Someone who needed him to be better than his grief. Someone who'd asked him a question that changed everything. "Do you also cry from hunger?" "Yes, Rose Murphy." He did cry from hunger, but maybe not the kind either of them had expected. Maybe some hungers could only be fed by feeding others. Maybe some emptiness could only be filled by offering shelter to those who had none. Rose was gone when Thomas woke up. The house felt hollow again, like someone had sucked all the warmth out of the walls overnight. He found her note on the kitchen table, written in careful, childish letters on a scrap of paper torn from somewhere. Thank you for the food in bed. I don't want to be a burden. I'll remember your kindness always. Rose. Thomas crushed the note in his fist and swore under his breath. Damn stubborn little thing. Didn't she understand that some people actually wanted to help, that not every kindness came with strings attached? He pulled on his boots and coat and headed outside into the gray morning. The storm had passed but left the world soggy and cold. Perfect weather for a child to catch pneumonia wandering around with no proper shelter. Thomas searched the obvious places first. The old barn she'd mentioned, the creek bed, the abandoned shacks scattered around the valley. Nothing. Rose had vanished like morning mist, leaving only the memory of her grateful smile and the echo of her question. Do you also cry from hunger? The words followed him as he expanded his search, riding his horse along every trail and path within 10 mi of his property. It was near noon when he finally spotted her. A small figure trudging along the main road toward town carrying a bundle of something in her arms. Thomas spurred his horse forward, and when he got close enough to call out, Rose turned with the startled look of someone caught doing something wrong. Rose Murphy, Thomas called, sliding down from his saddle. Where exactly do you think you're going? Rose clutched her bundle tighter, and Thomas saw it was wildflowers. Dozens of them picked from roadside ditches and arranged into rough bouquets. Into town, Mr. Garrett going to sell these to folks for a penny each. Maybe earn enough for some bread. The sight of those scraggly flowers broke something in Thomas that he'd thought was already shattered beyond repair. Here was a child so desperate to avoid charity that she'd rather hawk weeds to strangers than accept help from someone willing to give it freely. Rose, he said gently, you don't have to do this. You don't have to earn your right to exist. Rose's chin came up with stubborn pride. I'm not a beggar, Mr. Garrett. My pa taught me to work for what I need. Said charity makes people weak and lazy. Thomas wanted to track down her absent father and explain a few things about what made children weak and desperate. But Rose was watching him with defiant eyes that dared him to argue with her precious principles. Your P sounds like a smart man, Thomas said carefully. But he also sounds like someone who never went to bed hungry, wondering if tomorrow would bring food or just more empty belly. Sometimes Rose accepting help isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the smartest thing you can do. Rose wavered, uncertainty flickering across her face. But what if people think I'm just a lazy beggar girl looking for handouts? What if they get mad at me for taking when I haven't given anything back? The fear in her voice revealed everything. She'd been rejected before, turned away by people who thought children should earn their survival like adults. Let me ask you something, Rose, Thomas said, crouching down to meet her eyes. When you gave me that smile yesterday, when I offered you food, when you said thank you like you meant it, when you made my empty house feel like a home again just by being in it. What do you call that? Rose frowned, confused by the question. I don't know what you mean, mister. Thomas smiled sadly. That was you giving something back, Rose. You gave me purpose when I'd forgotten why I was still breathing. You gave me someone to care about when I thought caring was just another way to get hurt. You think that's worth nothing? Rose stared at him, processing his words. But I didn't do anything special. I just said thank you. Thomas nodded. Exactly. You just existed and said thank you, and it mattered. Some gifts don't look like work, Rose. Some gifts are just being human with other humans. Just letting people help when they need to help as much as you need to be helped. Rose looked down at her flowers, then back at Thomas. You really want me to come back, even though I can't pay you or do much work or anything useful? The hope in her question was devastating. She genuinely couldn't understand why anyone would want her around just for herself. Rose Murphy, Thomas said, standing up and extending his hand. I want you to come home. Not because you can work or pay or be useful, just because the house is too quiet without you, and because everyone deserves a place where they don't have to earn their right to belong. Rose stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment. Then slowly, carefully, she reached out and took it. Her fingers were small and cold, but they gripped his with desperate trust. Okay, she whispered. Okay, I'll come back. But I'm keeping the flowers. Maybe we can put them in a jar or something. The ride back to the ranch was quiet but not uncomfortable. Rose sat in front of Thomas on his horse, clutching her wildflower bouquets and asking occasional questions about the countryside. What kind of birds made those nests? Why did some trees lose their leaves and others didn't? Could you really tell whether from cloud shapes like old folks claimed? Simple questions that reminded Thomas how long it had been since he'd looked at the world through curious eyes instead of grief-clouded ones. Michael had asked similar questions, had seen wonder in ordinary things that adults forgot to notice. Back at the house, Thomas found himself moving differently. Instead of the heavy shuffle of someone just going through motions, he walked with purpose. He showed Rose where she could put her flowers in water, helped her arrange them in mason jars around the kitchen until the room looked alive with color. Made lunch that was actually appetizing instead of just fuel to keep functioning. Small actions that felt monumental after months of barely caring whether he lived or died. The flowers make everything prettier, Rose said, standing back to admire their handiwork, like the house is smiling now. That afternoon, Thomas did something he hadn't attempted since Michael's death. He worked on the ranch. Really worked, not just the bare minimum to keep things from complete collapse. He fixed the broken gate that had been hanging crooked for months, repaired fence posts that had been leaning dangerously, cleared debris from the barn that had been accumulating like physical evidence of his neglect. Rose helped carrying tools and holding boards and chattering about everything and nothing. Her presence made the work feel less like punishment and more like preparation, as if he was fixing things for a reason instead of just postponing their inevitable decay. "Mr. Garrett," Rose said as they worked on replacing rotted fence boards, "can I ask you something personal?" Thomas looked up from his hammer, surprised by her serious tone. "Sure, Rose, ask away." Rose chewed her lip nervously. "You got a son's grave in your yard, but no wife's grave and no wife in your house. What happened to your family?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. He'd been dreading this moment. The moment when Rose's natural curiosity would lead her to the painful truth about why he lived alone in a house meant for a family. Thomas set down his hammer and sat heavily on a pile of lumber. "How did you explain to a child that sometimes love wasn't enough, that sometimes you could do everything right and still lose the most important thing in your world?" "My wife died when Michael was born," Thomas said slowly. "Complications during delivery. I raised him by myself for 7 years. Then last spring he got sick with fever and I couldn't save him either. Lost them both, even though I tried everything I knew how to try." Rose's face crumpled with sympathy. "That's awful, Mr. Garrett. That's the saddest thing I ever heard. No wonder you looked so lonely when I found you." Thomas expected tears or awkward consolations, but Rose surprised him. She walked over and sat beside him on the lumber pile. "My ma died too," she said quietly. "When I was 5, P said it was her lungs that gave out, but I think it was really sadness. She missed her family back east. Something fierce. Used to cry when she thought I wasn't watching. After she died, P got real quiet and distant, like part of him died with her. Maybe that's why he went to the mines. Maybe he couldn't stand being around me because I reminded him of what he lost." The pain in her young voice was heartbreaking. She carried the same guilt Thomas knew so well. The weight of wondering if you were somehow responsible for the people you loved leaving you. "Oh," Thomas said firmly, "your ma's death wasn't your fault anymore. Then Michael's death was mine. Sometimes bad things happen to good people, and there's no reason for it. No sense to be made of it. But that doesn't mean we stop loving or caring or trying to build something good from what's left." Rose leaned against his shoulder with the trust of someone starved for comfort. "Do you think our people who died would want us to be happy again someday, even without them?" The question caught Thomas off guard. He'd been so focused on preserving his grief as a monument to Michael that he'd never considered whether his son would actually want him to suffer forever. "I think," Thomas said slowly, working through the thought as he spoke, "I think they want us to remember them with love instead of pain. Want us to honor them by living well instead of just surviving. Michael used to get so excited about simple things, butterflies and baby animals and fresh cookies. He'd probably be mad at me for forgetting how to notice good things." Rose nodded sagely. "Ma used to say that flowers grew best in ground that had been torn up and replanted. Said sometimes you had to break things apart before they could grow into something better. Maybe that's what happened to us, Mr. Garrett. Maybe we got broken so we could grow into people who take care of each other." That evening after supper, Rose asked if she could see Michael's room. Thomas's first instinct was to refuse. The room had been sacred territory untouched since the day Michael died, but something in Rose's respectful tone made him reconsider. "It's upstairs," he said quietly. "Second door on the right, but Rose, it's exactly like he left it. I haven't changed anything." Rose nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of what she was asking. She climbed the stairs with reverent steps like entering a church. Thomas waited in the kitchen, listening to her soft footsteps overhead. After a few minutes, she came back down carrying something in her hands. A wooden horse carved from pine, one of Michael's favorite toys. "He must have loved this," Rose said, holding the horse carefully. "It's beautiful. Did you make it for him?" Thomas nodded, his throat tight with memory. "For his 6th birthday, took me 3 weeks to get it right. He named it Thunder and carried it everywhere for months." Rose examined the carving with the appreciation of someone who understood the value of handmade gifts. "Could you maybe teach me to carve? I'd like to make something beautiful like this, something that would last." The request surprised Thomas. When was the last time someone had asked him to teach them anything? When was the last time his skills had seemed valuable to another person? "I suppose I could show you the basics," he said. "Got plenty of wood scraps and an extra knife, but it takes patience, Rose, and practice. Lots of cuts and mistakes before you make anything worth keeping." Rose's face lit up with excitement. "I got nothing but time, Mr. Garrett, and I like working with my hands. P used to say, I was good at fixing things that got broken." The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. Maybe they were both broken things learning to fix each other. That night, as Thomas prepared for bed, he realized something had shifted in the house. It felt lived in again. Felt like a home instead of a museum. Rose's wildflowers brightened the kitchen. Her laughter had chased shadows from corners that had been dark too long. Her presence had reminded him that houses were meant to shelter people, not just preserve memories. As he drifted off to sleep, Thomas found himself looking forward to tomorrow, looking forward to teaching Rose to carve, looking forward to watching her eyes light up when she successfully shaped wood into something beautiful, looking forward to being needed again. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other. Rose was at the kitchen table carefully whittling a piece of pine, while Thomas coached her through the proper angle for shaping what would eventually become a bird's wing. 3 weeks had passed since she'd returned from her flowering adventure, and the house had transformed into something neither of them had expected. A home where laughter happened naturally and silence felt comfortable instead of oppressive. Rose had proven herself gifted with the carving knife, producing delicate figures that reminded Thomas of his own early work. But it was her questions that truly amazed him. Not just about technique, but about why he'd chosen certain shapes, what inspired particular details, how he decided when a piece was finished. She saw artistry where he'd only seen whittling. The postman's knock interrupted their lesson. Thomas rarely received mail these days, bills mostly, or advertisements for farm equipment he couldn't afford. But the envelope the postman handed him was different, official looking, with a return address from the territorial mining office. Thomas's blood went cold as he recognized the significance. Mining offices only sent letters about 2 things: claims or casualties. "What is it, Mr. Garrett?" Rose asked, looking up from her carving. Her face was flushed with concentration and pride. She'd been working on the same bird for 4 days, determined to get every feather right. "Just mail, Rose," Thomas said carefully. "Keep working on that wing. You're getting the curve just right." Thomas stepped outside to read the letter in private. His hands shook as he unfolded the official document. The words swam before his eyes at first, then came into sharp, devastating focus. "We regret to inform you that Jeremiah Murphy was killed in a mine collapse on October 15th. His body was recovered and buried in the Riverside Cemetery outside Goldfield. Mr. Murphy listed your ranch as his last known address and requested that any correspondence regarding his daughter Rose be sent to your attention. Please advise how you wish to proceed with custody arrangements." Thomas read the letter 3 times before the reality sank in. Rose's father was dead, had been dead for 2 weeks. While Rose spent every evening watching the road, hoping to see him return home, he'd been lying cold in an unmarked grave hundreds of miles away. Thomas folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. How did you tell a child that her last hope had been buried while she was learning to carve birds and arranging wildflowers? How did you destroy someone's faith in happy endings when they'd already survived so much disappointment. Through the window, he could see Rose bent over her work tongue, poking out in concentration, the way Michael used to do when he was focused on something important. She looked so young sitting there, so innocent of the cruelty that was about to crash down on her small world. Mr. Garrett Rose called from inside. "I think I messed up the tail feathers." "Can you come look?" Thomas took a deep breath and walked back into the kitchen. Rose held up her carving with worried eyes. "I tried to make them fancy like real bird tails, but now they look all wonky." "Did I ruin it?" Thomas examined the wooden bird, fighting to keep his voice steady. The tail was indeed crooked, but it had character, personality. The imperfections made it unique instead of ruined. "It's not ruined, Rose. It's distinctive. Sometimes the mistakes are what make something special instead of just ordinary." Rose beamed at his words, and Thomas felt his heart crack. She trusted him completely, believed that he would always tell her the truth and help her fix whatever went wrong. How could he be the one to break that trust? How could he be the messenger of news that would shatter her carefully rebuilt hope? "Rose," Thomas said, sitting down beside her, "I need to talk to you about something important about your pa." Rose's face went bright with anticipation. "Did someone see him? Is he coming home? I knew he wouldn't forget about me. I knew he'd keep his promise." The hope in her voice was a knife twisting in Thomas's chest. "Rose, honey," Thomas said gently, taking her small hands in his larger ones, "your pa isn't coming home. He can't come home. There was an accident at the mine, and he couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't bear to watch hope die in her eyes." Rose stared at him for a long moment, processing what he wasn't saying. "He's dead, isn't he?" she whispered. "My pa is dead, like your Michael and my ma." Thomas nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. Rose didn't cry, didn't scream or rage or fall apart. She just sat very still, like someone trying not to breathe too hard because breathing might make the pain worse. "How long have you known?" Rose asked finally. Her voice was eerily calm, too calm for a child receiving the worst news of her life. "The letter came this morning," Thomas said. "I wanted to tell you right away. Didn't want to lie to you or pretend everything was fine when it wasn't." Rose nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me the truth. Some grown-ups would have made up stories to make it easier, but I'm glad you didn't treat me like a baby." The maturity in her response broke Thomas's heart. No child should have to be that strong, that accepting of unbearable loss. "What happens to me now?" Rose asked. The question Thomas had been dreading. What did happen to orphan children in the territory orphanages, if they were lucky workhouses, or worse if they weren't? The thought of Rose disappearing into some institutional hell made Thomas sick with rage. She'd survived too much to be destroyed by bureaucratic indifference. She'd brought too much light into his dark world to be swallowed by someone else's darkness. "I don't know, Rose," Thomas said honestly, "but I promise you won't face it alone. We'll figure it out together." Rose looked at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her face. "You don't have to take care of me, Mr. Garrett. I know I'm not your responsibility. You already did more than enough letting me stay here and teaching me things and making me feel like family. But I'm not really family, am I? I'm just a stray that wandered up to your door." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. "Rose Murphy," he said firmly, "look at me." Rose raised her eyes reluctantly. "You are not a stray. You are not a burden. You are not someone else's responsibility that got dumped on me. You are a brave, smart, funny little girl who made my life worth living again when I thought it never would be. You are the best thing that's happened to this house since Michael filled it with laughter. If anyone should be grateful here, it's me." Rose's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she threw herself into Thomas's arms. "But what if they take me away? What if some official people come and say I have to go live somewhere else? What if I never see you again?" Thomas held her tight, feeling her small body shake with grief and terror. "Nobody's taking you anywhere, Rose," he said with more confidence than he felt. "This is your home now. Legal or not legal doesn't matter. What matters is that you belong here, and I want you here. And anybody who tries to change that will have to go through me first." It was a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. The territorial authorities had broad powers when it came to orphan children, but he meant every word. He'd fight heaven and earth before he'd let anyone tear Rose away from the life they'd built together. That afternoon, Thomas rode into town, leaving Rose safely at the ranch, with instructions to not answer the door for anyone she didn't recognize. He needed information about custody laws and adoption procedures. Needed to know what legal hoops he'd have to jump through to make Rose officially his daughter. The territorial courthouse was a squat, ugly building that smelled of dust and disappointment. The clerk who helped him was a thin, nervous man who seemed shocked that anyone would voluntarily want to adopt an orphan. Most folks are trying to get rid of extra mouths to feed, the clerk said, shuffling through legal documents. You sure you want to take on this responsibility? Girl children are expensive. Gotta feed them and clothe them and eventually marry them off. That's a lot of years and a lot of money. Thomas gritted his teeth at the man's casual dismissal of Rose's worth. I'm sure, he said firmly. What do I need to do to make it legal? The clerk explained the process. Paperwork filed with the territorial government, character references from prominent citizens, proof of financial stability and moral fitness, a home inspection by territorial social workers. The whole bureaucratic nightmare could take months and there was no guarantee of approval. Of course, the clerk added with a meaningful look. Sometimes these things go faster if you know the right people. Judge Morrison handles most adoption cases, and he's particular about who he approves. Likes to see applicants who understand how things work around here. The implication was clear. Bribes, corruption, the same old system where money talked louder than love or need or what was best for a child. Thomas had savings from years of successful ranching before grief derailed his life. Enough to grease the right palms, if that's what it took to keep Rose safe. I understand, Thomas said quietly. Whatever it takes. The clerk smiled with satisfaction. I'll prepare the paperwork. You get those character references lined up. Judge Morrison particularly values recommendations from business leaders and church officials, men of standing in the community. Thomas nodded and left feeling dirty but determined. He'd play their corrupt game if it meant protecting Rose from worse alternatives. The ride home gave Thomas time to think about what he was really asking for. Not just legal custody of Rose, but the right to call himself her father. The responsibility of raising her into a woman who could face the world with strength and wisdom. The privilege of watching her grow and learn and become whoever she was meant to be. It was terrifying and wonderful and completely different from anything he'd planned for his life. But sitting in his empty house, mourning Michael forever, wasn't a plan either. It was just slow suicide disguised as grief. Rose was waiting on the porch when he returned. She'd been carving while he was gone, and her wooden bird now had delicate wing details and carefully shaped tail feathers. I fixed the tail, she said, holding up her work proudly. Used your advice about mistakes, making things special instead of just perfect. Look how the crooked feather makes it look like the bird is turning in the wind. Thomas examined the carving and felt his throat tighten with emotion. She was right. The imperfection gave the bird life and movement, made it unique instead of generic. It's beautiful, Rose, he said honestly. Best bird I've seen carved in years. You've got real talent. That evening over supper, Thomas explained what he'd learned in town. The adoption process, the paperwork, and waiting and uncertainty. Rose listened carefully, asking practical questions about timelines and requirements. What if they say no? She asked finally. What if Judge Morrison decides I'm not worth the trouble or you're not fit to be my pa? Thomas reached across the table and took her hand. Then we'll figure out another way, Rose. Maybe move somewhere else where nobody knows our business. Maybe just keep living like we are and ignore what the law says. But one way or another, you're staying here. That's not negotiable. Rose squeezed his hand gratefully, then asked the question that had been haunting them both. Mr. Garrett, would it be okay if I called you P, not because I'm trying to replace my real P or forget about him, but because you've been more of a father to me these past weeks than anyone else ever was, and because calling you Mr. Garrett feels too formal for family? Thomas felt tears threaten for the second time that day. I'd be honored, Rose, he said quietly. But only if you let me call you daughter. Not because I'm trying to replace Michael, but because you've made me remember what it feels like to be needed, what it feels like to have someone to protect and teach and worry about in all the best ways. Rose's smile was brighter than all her wildflowers combined. Yes, Pa. she said, testing out the word. I'd like that very much. And just like that, the last piece of Thomas's broken heart clicked back into place. Not healed exactly. Michael's absence would always ache, but functional again. Strong enough to love someone new without dishonoring someone lost. Strong enough to build a family from the ruins of two separate tragedies. Strong enough to fight for what mattered most. Rose was still in danger. The legal system could still tear them apart, but tonight they were father and daughter by choice, if not by law, and sometimes choice was stronger than blood. The woman who came to inspect their home arrived like winter itself, cold, unwelcome, and determined to find fault with everything she encountered. Mrs. Abernathy from the Territorial Children's Welfare Office stepped out of her black carriage with the sour expression of someone who'd already decided this was a waste of her valuable time. She was thin as a fence post with gray hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her disapproval into permanent lines around her mouth. Thomas watched from the kitchen window as she surveyed his property, with obvious distaste, making notes in a leather journal with quick, harsh strokes of her pen. "Pa," Rose whispered from beside him, her voice tight with worry. "She looks mean. What if she decides I can't stay?" Thomas put a reassuring hand on Rose's shoulder, though his own stomach was churning with anxiety. 3 weeks had passed since he'd filed the adoption papers. 3 weeks of waiting and preparing and praying that some bureaucrat wouldn't decide his love wasn't enough to make him a suitable father. "She's just doing her job," Rose Thomas said with more confidence than he felt. "We'll show her what a good home looks like and trust that she'll make the right decision." But Mrs. Abernathy's expression suggested she'd already made up her mind, and it wasn't in their favor. The knock on the door came sharp and impatient. Thomas opened it to find Mrs. Abernathy standing ramrod straight with her journal clutched against her chest like armor. "Mr. Garrett," she said in a voice that could freeze water in July, "I am Mrs. Abernathy from the Children's Welfare Office. I'm here to conduct the mandatory home inspection for your adoption petition regarding the minor child Rose Murphy." She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her sharp eyes immediately cataloging every detail of the kitchen. Thomas saw her notice the wildflowers in mason jars, the carved wooden birds on the windowsill, the warm light filtering through clean windows. But instead of appreciation, her face showed only professional skepticism. "This is Rose," Thomas said, gesturing to where Rose stood near the table, her hands folded neatly in front of her best dress. They'd spent an hour that morning making sure she looked respectable. Hair-braided face, scrubbed apron, spotless. "Rose, this is Mrs. Abernathy. She's here to visit with us for a while." Rose stepped forward with the careful politeness Thomas had coached her to display. "Good morning, Mrs. Abernathy," she said with a small curtsy. "Welcome to our home." Mrs. Abernathy's eyes narrowed as she studied Rose from head to toe, looking for signs of neglect or abuse, or whatever it was that welfare inspectors sought when they examined other people's children. Mrs. Abernathy said, making a note in her journal, "Child appears adequately nourished and clothed, basic cleanliness standards met." She spoke about Rose as if she weren't standing right there, as if she were livestock being evaluated for purchase, rather than a human being deserving of dignity and respect. Thomas felt his jaw clench but forced himself to remain calm. Losing his temper would only give this woman ammunition to use against them. "Rose has been thriving here," Thomas said carefully. "She's learning to read better, helping with household tasks, developing her artistic talents. She's brought nothing but joy to this home." Mrs. Abernathy sniffed dismissively. "Mr. Garrett, I deal with facts, not feelings. Joy is not a measurable indicator of proper child welfare. Now I'll need to inspect the premises thoroughly, starting with the child's sleeping arrangements." She swept toward the stairs without waiting for permission, her heavy boots echoing through the house like a funeral march. Thomas and Rose followed helplessly as the woman invaded their private spaces with clinical detachment. She examined Rose's room, Michael's former room, with particular scrutiny, checking the bed linens, measuring the window for adequate light, testing the floorboards for stability. "This room is quite large for a single child," Mrs. Abernathy observed, making more notes. "Perhaps excessively spacious. Children from impoverished backgrounds often struggle with too much comfort. It can breed laziness and unrealistic expectations about their station in life." Rose's face flushed with humiliation, but she remained silent as instructed. Thomas wanted to throttle the woman for her casual cruelty. How dare she suggest that Rose deserved less comfort simply because she'd been born poor? How dare she imply that showing kindness to a child was somehow harmful to their character development? The inspection continued for 2 grueling hours. Mrs. Abernathy examined every room, every closet, every corner of their lives with the thoroughness of someone looking for reasons to destroy rather than approve. She questioned Rose's education, her religious instruction, her moral development. She asked invasive questions about Thomas's finances, his past relationships, his reasons for wanting to adopt. Every answer was met with skeptical silence and more scribbled notes. "Tell me, Rose," Mrs. Abernay said during what felt like an interrogation disguised as a friendly chat. "Do you ever feel frightened or uncomfortable living here with Mr. Garrett? You can speak freely, child. I'm here to protect your interests." Rose's eyes darted to Thomas, then back to the social worker. "No, ma'am," she said quietly. "P takes good care of me. He teaches me things and makes sure I eat regular and never raises his voice or hurts me. He's the kindest man I ever met." Mrs. Abernathy's mouth pursed with displeasure at Rose's obvious affection for Thomas. "And what about discipline, Rose? How does Mr. Garrett correct your behavior when you misbehave?" Rose looked confused by the question. "I try not to misbehave, ma'am, but when I make mistakes, P just talks to me about doing better next time. He says mistakes are how we learn to do things right." The social worker made a sharp note in her journal. "No corporal punishment." "Then that's concerning. Children require firm discipline to develop proper respect for authority. Excessive permissiveness leads to moral corruption." Thomas felt his carefully maintained composure begin to crack. This woman wasn't evaluating Rose's welfare. She was looking for excuses to remove a happy child from a loving home based on her own rigid prejudices about how children should be raised. Mrs. Abernathy Thomas said evenly, "Rose is a well-behaved child who responds to kindness and guidance. She doesn't require harsh punishment because she wants to do right by the people who care about her." Once Mrs. Abernathy repeated with disdain, "Children should obey from duty and fear of consequences, not from wanting to please. Emotional manipulation is hardly proper child rearing, Mr. Garrett." She closed her journal with a decisive snap. "I've seen enough. I'll be filing my report with Judge Morrison within the week. You'll receive notification of his decision in due course." She gathered her things with brisk efficiency, clearly eager to escape their contaminated household. "One final question, Mr. Garrett. What exactly do you hope to gain from this adoption? Surely a man of your age would prefer the freedom of bachelorhood to the burden of raising someone else's child." The question revealed everything about Mrs. Abernathy's worldview. She couldn't conceive of someone adopting a child out of love rather than self-interest. Couldn't understand that sometimes broken people healed each other simply by choosing to care. "I hope to gain a daughter," Mrs. Abernathy Thomas said quietly. "Someone to love and guide and learn from. Someone who makes my life better just by being in it. If that's a burden, then it's the sweetest burden I've ever carried." Mrs. Abernathy's expression suggested she found his answer both pathetic and suspicious. She left without another word, her carriage disappearing down the road like a retreating storm cloud. Rose waited until the dust settled before speaking. "She hated us, Pa," she said with devastating clarity. "She hated us before she even met us. Why would someone take a job helping children if they don't like children?" Thomas pulled Rose into his arms, feeling her small body tremble with suppressed fear. "I don't know, honey," he said honestly. "Some people get so focused on rules and procedures, they forget about the humans those rules are supposed to protect. But we did our best, Rose. We showed her who we really are. That's all we can do." That evening, Thomas sat on the porch, smoking his pipe and trying not to think about worst-case scenarios. What if Mrs. Abernathy's report condemned their unconventional family? What if Judge Morrison decided a single man couldn't properly raise a girl child? What if they tore Rose away from the only stability she'd ever known and shipped her off to some institutional nightmare? The thought made him physically ill. Rose emerged from the house carrying her latest carving project, a wooden horse remarkably similar to the one Michael had treasured. "I'm making this for you, Pa," she said, settling beside him on the porch steps. "Thought you might like to have something I made with my own hands, something to remember me by if." She couldn't finish the sentence. Rose Murphy Garrett, Thomas said firmly, using the name he'd begun thinking of her by. You are not going anywhere. I don't care what that bitter woman writes in her report or what some judge decides from his high bench. You are my daughter in every way that matters, and I will move heaven and earth before I let anyone separate us. Rose leaned against his shoulder with the trust of someone who'd finally found her safe harbor. I love you, P, she whispered. Even if they take me away, I'll never forget that someone wanted me enough to fight for me. That's more than most orphans ever get. 3 days later, the letter arrived. Thomas's hands shook as he opened the official envelope, with Rose watching anxiously from across the kitchen table. He read the contents twice before the words sank in fully. Judge Morrison had reviewed Mrs. Abernathy's report and testimony from character witnesses. The adoption petition had been. Thomas looked up to find Rose staring at him with desperate hope. Well, Pa, what does it say? Do I get to stay? Thomas felt a smile spread across his face for the first time since the social worker's visit. You get to stay, Rose. You get to stay forever. Judge Morrison approved the adoption. You're officially my daughter now. Rose Murphy Garrett. It's legal and binding, and nobody can ever change it. Rose let out a whoop of joy that would have made Michael proud and launched herself into Thomas's arms. They held each other tight, two broken souls who'd found wholeness in choosing to become family. Outside, the October wind was picking up, promising another hard winter ahead. But inside their small ranch house, everything was warm and right, and exactly as it should be. Thomas thought about Mrs. Abernathy's question about what he hoped to gain from adoption. He'd gained everything that mattered: purpose and joy, and someone to love who loved him back unconditionally. He'd gained proof that broken things could be mended if you were patient enough to let them heal slowly. He'd gained a daughter who asked him questions that changed his life. Do you also cry from hunger? Yes, Rose, but not anymore. Spring came early that year, arriving with a gentleness that felt like forgiveness after the harsh winter that had brought them together. Rose stood in the garden behind the house, her hands dark with rich soil as she planted the vegetable seeds Thomas had bought for her 13th birthday. 3 years had passed since Judge Morrison made their family official. 3 years of growing and learning and discovering that love could indeed bloom in the most unlikely places. Rose had shot up like a weed herself, all long limbs and emerging grace, her face losing the hollow desperation of childhood hunger and gaining the confident glow of someone who knew she belonged exactly where she was. Pa, come look at this, Rose called, her voice bright with excitement. Thomas sat down the fence post he'd been repairing and walked over to where she knelt among the neat rows of planted seeds. She pointed to a small green shoot pushing through the dark earth. The beans are already sprouting. Look how determined they are to grow. Even though we just planted them yesterday, Thomas smiled at her wonder. After 3 years, Rose still found magic in ordinary miracles, still saw hope in tiny signs of life emerging from what looked like nothing. It was a gift she'd given him too, this ability to notice beauty in simple things he'd forgotten to appreciate. That's the way of beans, Thomas said, crouching beside her to examine the tender shoot. They're eager to get started, probably be climbing the poles before you know it. Rose brushed dirt from her hands and looked across their thriving ranch with satisfaction. The place had transformed under their combined efforts. Fences mended and painted, buildings repaired and improved, fields cleared, and planted animals healthy and multiplying. What had once been a monument to grief and neglect was now a working ranch again, productive and purposeful and alive with possibility. But it was more than the physical improvements that marked the change. The house itself felt different, filled with laughter and conversation, and the comfortable sounds of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Rose had claimed every room as her own, leaving traces of her personality everywhere. Carved wooden animals lined the windowsills. Books borrowed from the school teacher sat in stacks by the fireplace. Her sketches and pressed flowers covered the walls like declarations of belonging. This was home in the truest sense, built not from obligation or convenience, but from choice and commitment in daily acts of love. Thomas watched Rose work with the pride of someone who'd helped nurture something precious into full bloom. She'd grown into exactly the kind of young woman he'd hoped she would become: intelligent and capable, and kind, strong enough to face difficulties, but wise enough to ask for help when she needed it. Independent, but not distant, confident, but not arrogant. She'd inherited none of his blood, but somehow managed to embody all the best parts of his character while developing qualities uniquely her own. The scared, starving child who'd knocked on his door that winter night had become someone extraordinary. Pa, Rose said suddenly, her tone shifting to something more serious. I need to tell you something. Something I've been thinking about for a while now. Thomas felt a familiar flutter of worry. After 3 years of stability, he'd never quite shaken the fear that something would come along to disrupt their happiness. What is it, honey? You can tell me anything. You know that Rose stood and brushed dirt from her work dress, gathering her thoughts with the careful deliberation she'd learned from him. I've been accepted to the Teachers College in Denver. Miss Patterson helped me with the application, and they're offering me a partial scholarship. I could start in the fall if I wanted to. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, though he tried not to let his shock show on his face. Teachers College Denver, a life beyond the ranch that had been their whole world for 3 years. He'd known this day would come, eventually had even encouraged Rose's education and ambitions. But knowing something intellectually and facing it emotionally were entirely different experiences. That's wonderful, Rose. He managed, his voice only slightly strained. Miss Patterson always said you had the mind for teaching. You'd be good at it, patient and caring, and smart enough to help children understand difficult things. Rose studied his face with the perceptiveness that came from years of reading his moods and emotions. You're scared I'm going to leave you, she said gently. Scared I'm going to go off to the big city and forget about you and never come home again. Thomas started to deny it, but Rose held up a hand. Pa, you taught me to always tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable, so I'm going to tell you the truth now. Part of me is excited about college and learning new things and maybe seeing what's beyond these mountains. But a bigger part of me is terrified of leaving the only real home I've ever known. Terrified of being away from the only father who ever truly wanted me. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. Rose, you can't make decisions about your future based on fear, not fear of leaving and not fear of staying. You have to choose what feels right for the person you're becoming, not the person you used to be. Rose nodded slowly. I know that, Pa. And that's why I need to tell you the rest. I don't want to go to Denver. I want to teach, but I want to teach here in Copper Falls. Miss Patterson is retiring next year, and she says the school board would hire me if I had proper credentials. I could go to college and come back. Make this my life by choice instead of just by circumstance. The relief that flooded through Thomas was so intense it almost knocked him over. Rose wanted to stay, wanted to build her life here where they could remain family instead of becoming strangers, connected only by memory and occasional letters. But beneath the relief was something else, worry that she was limiting herself out of misplaced loyalty. Rose, are you sure that's what you really want? Not what you think I want, or what feels safe, but what you truly dream about for yourself. Rose smiled with the confidence of someone who'd thought through all the possibilities. Pa, 3 years ago, I was a hungry orphan with no future and no hope. You gave me everything that matters, a home and a family and the chance to become whoever I wanted to be. Now I know who that is. I want to be Rose Garrett, daughter of Thomas Garrett, teacher, in Copper Falls, woman who helps other lost children find their way home. That evening, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. It had become their ritual, this quiet time, when the day's work was done, and they could simply enjoy each other's company. Rose had her latest carving project in her lap, a delicate flower that seemed to bloom from the wood itself. Her skills had far surpassed Thomas's, now her artistic vision, transforming simple pieces of pine into objects of genuine beauty. P. Rose said as she worked, "Do you remember that first night when I asked if you also cried from hunger? What did you think I meant?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "I thought you were asking if I understood what it felt like to need something so desperately it hurt. And I did understand, though, not the kind of hunger you were talking about. I was starving for purpose, for someone to need me, for a reason to keep going, when grief felt like it might swallow me whole." Rose nodded thoughtfully. "I was asking about food hunger because that's all I knew then. But you heard soul hunger. And somehow, when we fed each other's souls, the food hunger went away too. Funny how that worked out." As darkness settled over their valley, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 years ago, he'd been a broken man waiting to die, surrounded by the ruins of dreams he'd given up on. Rose had been a starving child with no future beyond survival. Together, they built something neither could have imagined alone. A family based on choice rather than blood. A home filled with laughter instead of ghosts. A future bright with possibility instead of shadowed by loss. Rose Thomas said quietly, "I need to tell you something too. Something I should have said long ago." Rose looked up from her carving, giving him her full attention. "When you knocked on my door that night, you saved my life as much as I saved yours, maybe more. You gave me back my purpose and my hope and my faith that good things were still possible. You taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting what we've lost, but learning to love what we found. You made me proud to be a father again when I thought that part of my life was over forever." Rose set aside her carving and reached for his hand. "Pa, we saved each other. That's what families do. They catch each other when they fall and help each other remember how to stand up again." They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Tomorrow, Rose would write her acceptance letter to the Teachers College, beginning the next chapter of their story. She would study and learn and grow into the educator she was meant to be. But she would do it with the knowledge that home was waiting for her, that family was permanent, that love was stronger than distance or time or any of the forces that tried to tear people apart. Thomas thought about Michael sleeping peacefully in his grave beneath the cottonwood tree. His son would have loved Rose, would have been proud to call her sister. In a way, bringing Rose into their family had honored Michael's memory better than any monument of grief ever could. "Rose," Thomas said as they prepared to go inside for the night, "I have something for you, something I made." He pulled a small wooden box from his jacket pocket carved with intricate flowers and birds that seemed to dance across its surface. Rose gasped with delight as she opened it to reveal a pair of delicate wooden earrings shaped like tiny roses. "For when you graduate from college," Thomas said, "so you'll always remember where you came from and where you belong." Rose's eyes filled with tears as she held the beautiful gift. "Fa, they're perfect. The most beautiful things I've ever seen. I'll treasure them always." As they walked inside together, Thomas felt a deep sense of completion. Not the ending of their story, but the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. Rose would go to college and become a teacher and probably marry someday and give him grandchildren to spoil. She would build a life rich with purpose and joy and love. And through it all, she would be his daughter. Not because law or blood demanded it, but because they had chosen each other when the world seemed determined to leave them both alone. That choice had saved them both, had proven that families could be built from love and commitment rather than just biology, had answered the question that started it all. "Do you also cry from hunger?" Yes, they had both cried from hunger. And yes, they had both found the nourishment they needed in the simple act of caring for each other. The house settled around them with the contentment of a place where people belonged, where love lived and laughter echoed and hope flourished like spring flowers after a long, hard winter. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities and adventures. But tonight, Thomas Garrett and Rose Garrett were exactly where they were meant to be, home together. Family by choice, in love, in the miraculous grace that sometimes rescued broken souls and gave them second chances to build something beautiful from the ruins of what they'd lost.